Well, thank you very much for coming. I apologize for speaking in English, but I'm told that most of the audience here will understand, or all the audience here will understand English. That puts me in the uncomfortable position of being the only person in the room who speaks only one language. So thank you for your patience. I understand thank you for coming on what I understand is quite a sad day for Uruguay, the passing of former President Bache. But in many ways, that makes today an appropriate day to do this. My understanding is he implemented a number of important reforms that helped Uruguay move forward. Hopefully today we can work together and think of the further path forward to ensure prosperity in the future for Uruguay. I'd very much like to thank Hernan, who's been a great host while I've been here, and the marvelous work this institute is doing and the importance of this work for the future of Uruguay, and also my friends at the Atlas Network who made this possible. This should be a hopeful time for Uruguay. Growth has been mostly strong since the financial Argentinian crisis of the early 2000s. Very, very strong growth rate from 2004 to 2014, and my understanding is that President Bache had a lot to do with that. Uruguay suffered little from the crisis of the 2000s, the late 2000s. You're now classified as a rich nation, and democracy is firmly established, and the government is stable. But it's also a time of peril and challenge. You may be classified as a rich nation, but to reach the top tier of rich nations in North America, Europe, or the rich nations in Asia, you have to triple, not double, triple your income. So there's a long way to go, and to get there, to join the top tier of rich nations, you need much better policies. Uruguay needs much better policies than it has now. Growth has slowed in Uruguay, and you may be facing something that crippled the rich economies of North America and Europe not so long ago, and that is stagflation, where you combine high levels of inflation with slow growth, and the adjustment from that, if you get trapped into that, is hugely painful and difficult. So work needs to be done now to solve that problem. Uruguay is failing to improve productivity. On free wage negotiations contribute to stagflation and suppress, and this is terribly important, suppress productivity growth by breaking the connection between wages and productivity. Also, this centralized system of bargaining suppresses the ability of young, dynamic, small firms to become dynamic, large firms. Imagine, you would never have heard of Microsoft or Google or Apple if some sort of large government controlled, union-controlled sector was setting wages for them when they were young and vulnerable. They needed the flexibility and dynamism to grow huge, big, and globally important. So this sort of by mandate wage setting will be deadly for the growth of something Uruguay needs, and that is global champions. You're a small country of 3 million people. You need the world as your marketplace, and you need dynamic firms to make the world your marketplace. And one of the big problems is you need also more and more foreign investment, and yet Foreign firms report great trouble in negotiating the difficult and bureaucratic government here. Without reform, and we'll talk about Uruguay's situation and policy, Uruguay will never reach the top tier of rich nations. No nation with the policy mix that Uruguay has now has ever broken through to that top tier unless they're a petroleum nation. But more importantly, Uruguay is admired around the world for its stable democracy and incredibly high levels of personal freedom and a civil society. But without future growth, prosperity, and dynamism, all those things are threatened. All you have to do is look around the world and find out where the tolerant, democratic, free societies are. And every single one of them is either a rich nation or a nation that is growing more and more prosperous. If growth or prosperity falters, people become angry, frustrated, and disappointed, threatening the very stability that allows for tolerance, civil freedoms, and democracy. So it's not just the future prosperity of Uruguay that is at stake. It is all these other great and globally admired achievements. All you have to do now is look at Europe or even the United States. Already rich nations, but growth has faltered. And you see the ugly rise of populism, which does threaten freedom and even threatens democracy. So it is crucially important that Uruguay remain on the path that it was on from 2004 to 2014, and that is building higher and higher levels of prosperity in a dynamic economy, because things can go bad very, very quickly. So we'll talk about this later, but economic freedom, the ability of individuals and families to make their own economic decision, has been proven the great driver of growth globally. And I'll show you some information on that. But unleashing the drive and ingenuity of individuals and families beats government planning or the greed of crony capitalism, hands down every day in producing growth and prosperity. But Uruguay has been treading water in this. In fact, Uruguay in 2011 was 42nd in the world in economic freedom. That's not very good. It's not very good for an economy that needs to grow, but at least it's a hopeful sign. The most recent data from 2014, Uruguay has sunk to 74th in the economic freedom rankings of the world. In other words, it's almost doubled down its position. Uruguay has low or declining scores in key areas: rule of law, freedom to trade. Rule of law is probably the most important aspect of economic freedom. But freedom to trade for a small country of 3 million people is absolutely essential. You need the world as your marketplace, the world to sell to. And you need the people of Uruguay to be able to buy from the world. You cannot produce, no more than my nation, Canada, which is 30 million people, can produce all the products we need, nor can we create the marketplace for prosperity. So Uruguay needs the world as its marketplace and its shopping center. And many levels of regulation are also getting worse. I want to give you some shock numbers to give you an idea of how essential it is for further reform. This is the most recent World Doing Business report. And overall, Uruguay rates 92nd. That's an impossible ranking to create further prosperity. Registering property, something that should be simple, straightforward, and is essential, property rights essential to building prosperity. 110th. Paying taxes. It's extraordinarily, apparently, according to World Business, it's extraordinarily difficult to pay taxes. They're complicated in Uruguay. 130th. Trading across borders. This is what I was discussing before, how Uruguay needs the world as its marketplace. 153rd. Way, way, way down at the bottom. Enforcing contracts. An essential aspect of economic freedom and free markets, 104th. Protecting minority investors, 122nd. This is hugely important. It may seem to be almost a bit of trivia or getting down into the details, but to get investment, people have to be confident that when they invest in a company, their property in that company, their shares, their rights are protected, and they aren't here. Dealing with construction permits, 160th in the world. And starting a business, this is where you do best in the ones that I'm showing you, 61st. But that's not very good at all. So I want to take a look at economic freedom and why it's important. It's an annual compilation of data. It includes 156 countries. The key thing that I want to mention here is we produce none of the data in the Economic Freedom of the World report. It all comes from third-party sources like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the Country Risk Guide, like the World Competitiveness Forum. All data relevant to economic freedom, but not produced by us. And that is terribly important, because that means our subjective judgments, for instance, of a country like Uruguay, cannot affect the data. If we happen to think overly well or overly poorly of Uruguay, it doesn't matter. We produce none of the data, but we compile the data in a very transparent way, so actually anyone can go in and duplicate what we do. This is a classic definition of economic freedom. Individuals have economic freedom when the property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property so long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. What that fundamentally means, that's a lot of verbiage, and it's important to be precise, but what that fundamentally means is individuals and families can make their own economic decisions. They can start a business if they wish. They can go work for somebody if they wish. They don't have to spend hours cutting through red tape to do things. They can make their own economic decisions in a timely manner. We look at 5 areas: size of government and taxation. If government taxes too much of your property, it reduces your economic freedom. If government spends too much, even if the money is coming from an outside source, it reduces economic freedom by reducing the space for free exchange. Private property and the rule of law, absolutely essential. The infrastructure of economic freedom. If laws prevent you from doing things or make it difficult to do things that you should be freely allowed to do, economic freedom doesn't exist. And worse, this applies less to Uruguay, where corruption is low. If there is not a good rule of law, the rich and powerful use their strength to suppress the economic freedom of the poor and the weak. Sound money, this is a challenge that has been solved virtually everywhere in the world. In fact, inflation is not now the problem in most places, it's deflation. But Uruguay is one of the few places that it still has an unacceptably high inflation rate. and this could be a crisis for the future. Trade regulation and tariffs, we've discussed this, and regulation of business, labor, and capital markets. You should be able to start a business when you wish, close it when you wish. You should be able to work for whom you wish, and you should be able to hire whom you wish. And by the way, a key part of that is firing. You should be able to fire someone when you need to. People don't understand this. They think that laws that prevent workers from being fired protect jobs. No, they stop jobs from being created. If you're an employer and you hire someone and you can't fire them or lay them off if the economy turns down, your business might go bankrupt. If you can't dismiss an unproductive or disruptive employee, it can infect your whole workforce. So if you want to create jobs, you need to be able to fire people. Now that's not a license or to fire people on a whim. There should be appropriate protections, but these appropriate protections must be appropriate. Talk about making a difference. We now have member partners in over 100 nations, in almost 100 nations and territories, and associate members also, so we have well more than 100 members of our Economic Freedom of the World Network. If you look first in the left-hand corner right at the top, you'll see this institute here, and I'll give you a chance to read the rest. Okay, you got that? Economic freedom has proved to be such a benefit that it has steadily increased over time. Unfortunately, in the last few years, while the world has been increasing in economic freedom, Uruguay has been decreasing. Economic rights are fundamental in that without them there can be no political freedom or civil freedoms. I mentioned earlier about the threat to Uruguay's great achievements in democracy, freedom, and tolerance without economic prosperity and growth. And that really is a threat. You've seen it happen in other countries. Argentina, for example, in the earlier part of the 20th century. Same thing in Uruguay in the earlier part of the 20th century. And you see the chaos now reigning in Argentina and Brazil. It is hugely important to maintain good economic policies, to maintain also democracy and civil freedoms. Economic freedom also is important in establishing a basis of trust in a society. If government controls too much of the economy, if it limits your choices, as for instance it does in the telecom industry now, you have to buy what government gives you. And it doesn't matter because you have no choices. It doesn't matter whether it's good for you or not. That lowers trust. But in an economically free society where there's free entry, where new businesses can set up, where you'd have a whole bunch of choices in the telecom industry, you will only buy something if you think that buying that thing makes you better off because you have choices. In other words, both parties have to benefit. That has a huge impact on the level of trust in a society where there is choice and where people have to attract you as a customer, as opposed to the level of trust when you have no choice. Now, I'm going to show you some slides which are simply snapshots in time. And I want to be very honest with you. Snapshots in time really don't mean much. They're simple matters of correlation. But all the snapshots in time that I will show you reflect much more sophisticated research. Over 500 articles have used the peer-reviewed and policy articles have used the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And the slides I show you reflect this research. The first article using the Economic Freedom Index appeared in the American Economic Review, probably the most prestigious academic publication in the world, and it showed that economic freedom spurred growth. Now, this is the quarter most free nations, and as you can see, they have an average per capita income of about $39,000 a year, as opposed to about $6,000 in the least free nations. Uruguay is somewhere in here, and to move up to here, it needs to improve its economic freedom. But a lot of folks say, okay, well, economic freedom is fine in producing lots of money, but none of it goes to the poor. It's all the rich and the powerful that gain from economic freedom. So we grant you there's more growth. We grant you the per capita income is higher, but that's because it's only the rich that benefit. So let's take a look at that. This is not my favorite slide. It reflects the research, but it's not my favorite slide. It shows that economic freedom has almost no impact on inequality. I'd like to say that it reduces inequality, but the poorest 10% in economically free nations earns about 2.5% of the national income. It's about the same, a little less, but about the same in the least free nations. So even though this shows a little higher level of share of national income for the most free nations, this is basically a random walk. And what the literature has shown, and there's been a whole bunch of research on this, is exactly that. That a non-economically free nation has about the same level of inequality as an economically free nation. So economic freedom is not a solution for inequality, but it doesn't make inequality worse, and that's an important point. But here is the miracle. Because economically free nations produce such a higher level of prosperity, that same percentage of national income is profoundly different. So in economically free nations, the poorest 10% earn a little over $9,000 US a year. In the least economically free nations, the poorest 10% only get an income of about $1,000 a year. So, and this is hugely important. So economic freedom does not reduce inequality. It does not increase inequality. But what it does is dramatically reduce poverty and human suffering. None of us like what is the way Chile went to free markets. Chile, at the time of its free market reform, had one of the highest levels of desperate poverty in South America. Under free market reform, that has virtually disappeared. One of the few nations in Latin America to rid itself of desperate poverty. Freedom and governance. This is what Freedom House calls political rights. It's in effect democracy. And you can see there's a much higher level of democracy for the reasons I mentioned in economically free nations than in other nations. This is why failure to move forward with economic freedom does threaten the great achievements. Civil rights, this is basically other freedoms, personal freedom, the same pattern, and again for the reasons I've already mentioned. Economic freedom, and now, again, Uruguay is in a very lucky situation in that it has relatively low levels of corruption. The more and more government intrudes into the economy, the greater and the greater the threat of corruption becomes. Lack of economic freedom is the raw material of corruption. If I need to ask some bureaucrat permission to do something, there's someone to pay off. If you hold a monopoly and I can only buy from you, then that opens up corruption too, because you can charge any price you want. There's not a marketplace keeping you honest, so you can start doing handouts. So lack of economic freedom is the raw material of corruption. Economic freedom causes corruption to wither. If you're economically free and there's no one's permission to ask to do something, there's no one to pay off. If you're running a company that's competing in the marketplace, you can't make payments to your favorite cousin or hire your incompetent nephew, because you've got to compete against all the other groups. So lack of economic freedom is the raw material of corruption. And if the government of Uruguay becomes more and more influential in the economy, you risk creating higher levels of corruption. This is actually one of my favorite charts. Those who oppose economic freedom and free markets used to say, gave up on the prosperity argument. So they said, well, prosperity doesn't really matter. It's life satisfaction and happiness that really matter. And who could be happy in a dog-eat-dog capitalist world? Well, there's been a lot of sophisticated research on this, and with apologies to our leftist friends, people are happier in economically free nations. And this research has been very sophisticated. It's looked at levels of income and corrected for it, and it finds that economic freedom is one of only two things that is actually an independent driver of happiness. As it turns out, despite what our leftist friends say, people like to make their own decisions, like to have control of their lives. Who knew? Life expectancy at birth. Because of all these other benefits, people in economically free nations have longer lifespans. A lifespan of about 80 years. I'm very, very glad to say that I was born in an economically free nation, because this is how old I am right now. So I'm glad I have this to look forward to. Literacy. Literacy is much higher in economically free nations because you have to make your own way. It's not who you know, it's not which tribe you belong to, it's not which party you are in, it's how well you can perform. And that applies to men and women, girls and boys. So not only does literacy and other educational achievements increase, but the gap between men and women, girls and boys decreases. I can't pretend to be an expert on Uruguay, but from what I understand, Uruguay is facing a crisis in its education system. Teachers' unions, and I travel a lot, and unfortunately, teachers' unions are the enemy of good education all around the world. And I am told that teachers' unions, and I've read that teachers' unions here, want to cut the link between performance and education. They want to get paid with no responsibility at all. Uruguay needs a dynamic education system and a free education system where parents and students have choices, to move ahead aggressively. Now, your last president, Mojica, is probably not very much admired in this room. I don't know. I'll just leave that aside. But I read an interview that he gave to The Economist. And whether he believed this or not, he actually said in this interview that education needed to be decentralized, that parents and children needed choices in the education system, that it should not be run on high. And he didn't talk about the unions, but you might say that too, though he wouldn't. So this is something that even our friends on the left understand. This is crucial. Okay, I'm just going to now run through some longer-term successes. I've shown you some snapshots overall. Let's look at some individual examples. South America, where we are right now. That's what happened with economic freedom in South America. It jumped up like it did worldwide, but then but then nothing happened. Now, no one, as I said before, likes the way Chile moved to free market reform. That said, every government, including leftist governments that have followed those reforms, have kept them in place because they're evident, because they are so, because they work so well for the people. So you see what happened to Chile. It went from below the average level of economic freedom in South America to well above it, often in the top 10. So let's see what happens to, oh, by the way, before we go there, remember that level of economic freedom for South America, a little over 6. Okay, so, well, after the move, slight increase in economic freedom, Latin American growth improved. But look what happened to Chile. It went from below the average income in Latin America, and it took off like a rocket. And that's exactly where free market reforms happen. Can you imagine if over 30 years Uruguay grew like that? You'd be as rich as Switzerland. I'd have to move here. You'd be richer than Canada. But instead you're going in the wrong direction. Asia. You can see, by the way, oh, I'll go back here a moment. So, and take a look where the average per capita income is in South America. It's around $5,000. So look at Asia. You'll see the Southeast Asian average is a little bit above the Latin American average. South Korea, one of the more dynamic economies in the world, increased economic freedom, but has never really reached the top level. It's done pretty well, but it's never really reached the top level. Singapore is typically number 2 in the world. How does this translate into income? Well, there's Southeast Asia, a little better in economic freedom than South America, and a little better in per capita income than South America. In other words, the stories match. Korea, wow. It left the rest of Southeast Asia behind, starting from about the same level of income. And look what happened to Singapore when it moved to what is in effect the second highest level of economic freedom in the world. Like a rocket ship, rather reminiscent of what you saw with Chile. But you know, it's not just these famous examples. Here's something from Africa. The scale is a little bit different. Africa did increase in economic freedom, but that's a low level. Botswana moved to the highest rank in economic freedom in Africa. And look what happened to their income. Low level of economic freedom, virtually no growth in sub-Saharan Africa on average. Now, does that remind you of Chile? Now, by the way, Botswana is rich in, this is remarkable. Botswana went from one of the poorest nations in sub-Saharan Africa, and that means really, really, really poor, to one of the richest nations. In fact, its rate of growth was often greater than the tigers like Singapore and South Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, Botswana is rich in diamonds, but many, many, many African nations are rich in natural resources. And this is what they've done with their natural resources. And this is what Botswana, with a high level of economic freedom, has done. So I've probably spoken too long. This is the end lesson. And everything the Fraser Institute does is available for free download on these sites. So you can check up, see if I got things right. And thank you very much for coming here today.